Welcome to Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities. Allow me to begin by telling you a little bit about this series. In the academic year 2020 to 2021, Habib University's program in Comparative Humanities and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies launched a fortnightly webinar series titled Islam After Colonialism. This series charted the dramatic transformations under the devastating global impact of modern apartheid colonial rule in the nature of quote-unquote Islam in South Asia across culture, religion, politics, society, and the arts. The decolonial question of alternative pasts and futures was an important part of Islam after colonialism, given that contemporary concepts and imaginations of history, religion, politics, culture, and ethics remain hostage to the modern colonial heritage. This year, our new series, Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, while remaining in a similar constellation of concerns and perspectives, extends beyond South Asia, as well as focusing in on the spiritual, ethical, and religious resources and potentialities that have been marginalized or obscured through the co-optation of religion, quote unquote, that is, by colonialism and its inheritor, nationalism. In an increasingly troubled world, decolonial Islamic spiritualities are essential to the conceptual and existential strength of individuals and communities as they strive towards futures that are reparative rather than destructive. I'm Nauman Naqvi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Humanities here at Habib University in Karachi. And my colleague, the director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, will introduce our distinguished speaker for today. Over to you, Sajjad.
Thank you, Nauman, and welcome to everyone from me as well. I think it's a nice development today that we're in line with our decolonial agenda. We're going beyond South Asia, and also we're going beyond a narrowly kind of Arab-centric conception of what Islam is by looking at the broader Indian Ocean system, bringing that in. And who better to do that for us than Syed Ismail Alatas, who is an assistant professor at NYU. He's an anthropologist and historian. And he's recently published, I think, quite a significant work with a very broad and telling title for our days. It's entitled, "What is Religious Authority? Cultivating Islamic Communities in Indonesia." It just came out with Princeton University Press last year. It, of course, raises that very important question of how religious authority is constructed, but significantly brings in that the transnational, that interconnected, that perhaps cosmopolitan experience of Islam, which has been so significant for many people, all the way across from the Arabian Peninsula down to the Malay Archipelago and even beyond. Today, he will be addressing specifically, the title of his presentation today is Decolonizing Space-Time, Scalar and Societal Imaginaries in the Hajj Travelogue of an Indonesian Muhaddith. So again, it continues that theme of connecting people across from Indonesia all the way through to the Hijaz. And I'm quite interested in, particularly in the decolonizing space-time element of the title. So anyway, without further ado, it's a real pleasure. Ismail, please, over to you.
Thank you. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Thank you both Sajjad and Nauman for your invitation. It is quite an honor for me to participate in this now famous seminar series that I myself always look forward to watching. I'm particularly happy because it gives me the opportunity to present a work in progress that I hope will become part of a book-length a project on thinking about invisible presence in Muslim history and social life. So please forgive me for the rather half-baked nature of this presentation. I choose to present this work here, not because I think it is already well thought, but precisely because I'm hoping to benefit from your engagement with it and to learn from both of you. To state it briefly, in this talk, I'm interested in exploring Islamic societal frameworks that have been marginalized through the cooptation of religion by colonialism and nationalism, hence the theme of this seminar series, but also have remained under-theorized in the historical and anthropological studies of Islam. In particular, I am interested in societal frameworks that posit and hence render meaningful alternative scalar imaginaries from that of the global, the local, and the national. Scale, of course, is not just a neutral frame for viewing the world. Scale must be brought into being, scale must be proposed, practiced, and evaded, as well as taken for granted, right? A particular scale becomes conceivable and meaningful when it is given a perceptible shape that allows humans to actively imagine it and make sense of their emplacement within it. In this sense, societal frameworks are both constituted by and constitutive of scalar imaginary. A societal framework helps to bring a particular scalar imagination into being. At the same time, scalar imagination helps people to conceive their social or societal existence. Now, historical and sociological works on Islam have, of course, highlighted how religion helps to project and sustain scalar imaginaries for its practitioners, right? Among others, by positing particular social or societal frameworks. At the same time, they show how changing scalar imaginaries transform the way Muslims think about Islamic societal frameworks. For example, scholars talk about the changing meaning of the framework of ummah and its relationship to the scalar notion of the global. Others look at frameworks like jama'ah, for example, a prayer congregation that materializes 5 times a day in a neighborhood prayer hall or village mosque, and its relationship to Muslims' imagination of the local. With a few exceptions, however, I get the sense that most of these works, including my own previous works, focus on either the global, the national, or the local. As a result, Muslims are often depicted as either unwavering globalists or resolute nationalists or localists, right? But do Muslims imagine other scales beside the global, the national, and the local? How about an intermediate scale like the trans-regional that has increasingly drawn scholarly interest? Is the trans-regional a mere analytic category deployed by scholars? Or is it also a meaningful scale for the people they study? Are there meaningful Islamic societal frameworks that hinge on and reproduce an intermediate scalar imagination akin to what we now call the trans-regional? I would suggest there are, although they are often difficult to think about. And that, I think, has to do with the limitation of the social scientific theorization of society. The post-Enlightenment notions of society that social scientists are accustomed to, those going back to the works of Smith, Marx, and Durkheim, posit societies as bounded, internally constituted, and encompassing aggregates, thereby rendering the existence of dispersed and less integrative societies, what Eng Seng Ho has called mobile societies that take shape in between regions, analytically unrecognizable. So the challenge here is to think outside of those post-Enlightenment presuppositions of what a society is, in order to recover other societal frameworks, particularly those that imagine the possibility of dispersed and spatially expansive human social existence that nevertheless is characterized by a significant degree of interaction and a sense of temporal continuity. And then there's the question of time. Is scale only spatial, or does it also involve a particular imagination of time? If a scale is spatio-temporal, can we think about a meaningful Islamic scalar imaginary that is not presentist? Perhaps one that proposes a different logic of temporality, one that perhaps does not presuppose a strict demarcation between what we usually call the past and the present. And is there an Islamic social or societal framework that hinges on and reproduce that alternative spatiotemporal scale. And here I'm thinking about Charles Taylor's discussion of modern social frameworks that presuppose a novel understanding of space and time as empty containers that things and events contingently fill, rather than as constituted by what fills them. Taylor argues how this objectified space and time serve as the background in and through which social existence, actions, and relations are understood to take place, thereby engendering the development of modern socio-political concepts like the sovereign people, the economy, and the public sphere, all of which share an assumption of social existence as hinging on a horizontal, simultaneous, mutual presence. So can we think outside of this modern social imaginary and its spatio-temporal presuppositions in an effort to explore other social or societal frameworks that is constituted by and constitutive of alternative spatio-temporal scale? As you can see, Nauman and Sajjad, I have proposed several questions that I think is impossible to answer at this point, but I will nevertheless try to address them, albeit, of course, in a preliminary way. And I want to do this by thinking about one particular concept, namely ta'ifa, a concept that I think most scholars of Islam and Muslim society are perhaps familiar with, but remains, in my view, under-theorized and has not received proper analytic attention. The term ta'ifa has been translated and defined as people, clan, guild, intimate community, or even religious minority. The term, of course, appears 24 times in the Quran to refer to a group or company of humans. In its later usage, it came to denote a division or class of people, a distinct community, or a trade or professional group. Michael Cooperson actually provides a more useful definition of ta'ifa as a group entrusted with an exclusive body of knowledge or characteristic activity. Of course, historically, there are different ta'ifas, from religious and mystical to those based on a particular craft. These ta'ifas consist of individuals who may be spatially and temporally dispersed, but nevertheless are connected to each other through shared practice that can be traced back to a temporal point of origin. I became interested in exploring the concept of ta'ifa as a societal framework after encountering it in the works of a Hadrami Indonesian muhaddith, Syed Salim bin Ahmad bin Jindan. For example, in a counsel given to his family and friends towards the end of his life, bin Jindan wrote, "I counsel my children, family, friends, relatives, and those who love me that each one of them should not fail in this life to join the Ta'ifat al-Muhaddithin, for prophetic knowledge is the fount of well-being and security. Leaving it is the fount of discrepancy and destruction. This Ta'ifa is like the Ark of Noah. Those who embark it will be safe, while those who turn away from it are doomed. This Ta'ifa is our means for becoming connected to the Prophet." Now, from bin Jindan's works, I get a sense that the Ta'if al-Muhaddithin is imagined as being composed of individuals dispersed across different time and place who are connected to one another by virtue of their participation in the embodied transmission of hadith. Muslims, notwithstanding their backgrounds, are able to join this ta'ifa without having to disown their belonging to a local or national society or their belonging to a Sufi order for that matter. What I gradually realized is that conceiving the Ta'ifat al-Muhaddithin involves an alternative understanding of space and time from that which makes up a modern society, primarily because this Ta'ifa is imagined as being non-isomorphic with particular space and time, even when it may intersect with them. Spatially, this ta'ifa is imagined to unfold between the local and the global and connect several different regions through the practice of hadith transmission. Temporally, if a modern society hinges on calendrical time, that clearly separate the past from the present and allows for conceptions of contemporaneous simultaneity, the Ta'ifat al-Muhaddithin also presupposes the possibility of a non-contemporaneous contemporaneity, to use Harry Haritunian's term. Conceiving the Ta'ifa al-Muhaddithin thus requires a conception of space-time not simply as objective empty containers, but also as a processual nexus constituted by practice. To better comprehend the societal framework, its scalar imaginary, and how it is imagined by those who belong to it, I want to turn to an early 20th century ḥajj travelogue dictated by bin Jindan to his daughter, Fatima al-Alawiyah, 4 years after his 1930 pilgrimage to Mecca. And by the way, I use scare quote for the term ḥajj travelogue for a reason that I will explain. Bin Jindan titled the text An-Nafhat al-Miskiyah fi Rihlat al-Makkiyah, the breath of mosque in the Meccan journey. My interest in this text is less historical, but more conceptual, in that I'm trying to think how this text reproduces an imaginary of the Ta'ifa al-Muhaddithin, even in the absence of explicit theorization, right? In fact, what I find useful from Taylor's notion of the imaginary is precisely in how it enables us to think about how human comprehend their social existence and its constitutive background components, like particular conception of space and time, not through explicit theories or models, but through implicit and often inarticulate images, stories, and other culturally specific repertoires that are often left unstructured. If we deploy this notion of imaginary as an analytic concept, I think it can help us explore how a societal framework like a ta'ifa becomes thinkable to people, even in the absence of explicit theorization. To begin with, the prologue of this text makes clear that the Nafhat was not written for the general Muslim audience, but for a special subset, namely those interested in the acquisition of religious knowledge. This is perhaps one of the reasons why bin Jindan chose to write it in Arabic and not Indonesian. Despite its claim as a travelogue, the text concludes with bin Jindan's 1930 departure from Mecca from the port of Surabaya in East Java. While the text provides a rich account of bin Jindan's preparation for the journey, those who are looking for a description of the journey itself or of the Hijaz are bound to be disappointed. Instead, bin Jindan begins and devotes the bulk of the text to recounting multiple chains of transmission or isnad of a single hadith of the Prophet Muhammad regarding the importance of correct intention as a prerequisite of action. What ought to be a travelogue gives way to a compilation of isnad that takes 18 out of the total 31 pages of the manuscript. As if prefiguring the actual physical journey to Mecca, which is absent from the text, this isnad connect bin Jindan to the Prophet Muhammad through transgenerational scholarly networks. Now, whereas chapter 1 is written as a compilation of isnad, chapters 2 and 3 are composed as a rihla, as a travelogue. Chapter 2 records bin Jindan's travels around East Java to prepare for his journey to Mecca. This involves meeting various acquaintances who helped Jindan cover the cost of the journey and his engagement with the Dutch colonial bureaucracy. Chapter 3 describes the last few days before Jindan's departure. It recounts a pre-Hajj reception held for bin Jindan in his family home and the visit of relatives before and on the day of his departure. The text concludes with the Tanimbar, the ship carrying bin Jindan, setting sail on December 12, 1930. Now, what I find interesting about the text is the way it combines the genres of isnad, compilation, and rihla. Muslim scholars have often combined different textual genres to produce certain discursive effects. Here, I want to observe the combination of the isnad compilation and the rihla in a single text. More specifically, however, I want to focus on how each genre configures a different chronotope or representation of spatio-temporal nexus. The first half of the Nafhat charts multiple isnad of a single hadith. This isnad brings together 252 names of transmitters who connect bin Jindan to the Prophet Muhammad. These individuals came from different parts of the world, including the Hijaz, Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, South Asia, the Malay-Indonesian archipelago, and West Africa. Jindan himself received the hadith directly from 44 contemporaneous transmitters residing in different regions, some of whom he encountered during the Hajj, as he made clear in the Isnad. In recounting his Isnad, bin Jindan identifies 6 regional clusters of hadith transmitters, all of which are interconnected. The first is that of scholars residing in Mecca, whom bin Jindan encountered during his pilgrimage. Most of these scholars transmitted the hadith from the eminent 19th century Shafi'i Mufti of Mecca, Ahmad bin Zaini Dahlan, whose Isnad go back to the Meccan scholar Abdullah bin Salim al-Basri, who, according to Khalid Ru'ayhab, was responsible for the reinvigoration of hadith study in Mecca. The second cluster is that of South Asian scholars. Jindan obtained this Isnad from 2 South Asian scholars who migrated to Java, in addition to 2 others he encountered in the Hijaz. This Isnad converged in Shah Waliullah al-Dihlawi. The third regional cluster consists of scholars from Egypt. This is not linked bin Jindan to notable professors of Al-Azhar, including Muhammad al-Ashmuni, Shamsuddin al-Anbabi, and Abdurrahman al-Sharbini. The fourth cluster is that of scholars from the town of Zabid in Yemen, known as the home of the Al-Ahdal Sayyids, the Sayyidat al-Ahadila. All of the Isnad converge in the early 19th century Mufti of Zabid, Abdurrahman bin Sulaiman al-Ahdal. Also converging in Al-Ahdal are the Isnads that Jindan received from his fellow Hadrami scholars, which form the fifth cluster. Both clusters 4 and 5 converge in the famed Bilgram-born scholar Muhammad Murtada Zabidi, who died in Cairo in 1791. The final cluster consists of Jawi scholars, that is, those who hail from the Malay-Indonesian archipelago, some of whom have migrated to Mecca. This Isnad go back to a Hadrami scholar who resided in Medina, Hashim bin Sheikh al-Habashi, and to Saleh bin Muhammad al-Fulani, a hadith scholar from Futa Jalon in present-day Guinea. Despite their expansive geographic dispersal, almost all of this regional Isnad converged in the Egyptian Shamsuddin Muhammad bin Alauddin al-Babili, a scholar described by Stefan Reichmuth as the most elevated Egyptian traditionist of the 17th century. This Isnad go back to the 15th century Cairene judge Zakaria al-Ansari. From al-Ansari, the sanad bifurcates into parallel chains that go through Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, Jalaluddin Suyuti, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, al-Hafid al-Dhahabi, and Yahya bin Sharaf al-Nawawi, before converging again in the Damascene judge Abul Khair Muhammad al-Jazari. From al-Jazari, the chain follows a single path through Transoxania, Khorasan, and Iraq, before terminating in Medina with Umar ibn al-Khattab, who heard the hadith directly from the Prophet Muhammad. So Jindan's Isnad present a long durée movement of a single hadith from the Hijaz to Java through the works of its multi-generational transmitters, scattered across, but concentrated in several regions that became interconnected with one another. The individuals whose name graced Jindan's Isnad came from a variety of ethnic, linguistic, and genealogical backgrounds. They came from different tariqas as well. Many were mobile actors who oscillate between regions. While heavily dominated by men, one can also recognize several female transmitters in the Isnad. What brought these names together is the act of relaying prophetic hadiths and the shared belief in the moral imperative of such transmission. These mobile actors shared affinities with other like-minded actors inhabiting different time and space, making them simultaneously gharib, or foreign, but also qarib, familiar to each other. They form and renew ties between them through hadith transmission. Note that they are socially and morally tied to one another without necessarily forming an aggregate. What makes the Isnad a chronotope are implied spatial and temporal features, including location, directionality, sequence, and succession. The Isnad projects a conception of space and time not as empty arenas or containers of action, but as a processual nexus generated by action. Embodied transmission forms what Nancy Munn aptly terms a spatio-temporal process that connects persons and places, old and new, and is liable to further expansion, contraction, or abrupt termination. Transmissions do not merely occur in and through space and time, but instead are imagined to constitute a space-time. One important feature of this processual space-time is its elasticity and ability to engender a non-contemporaneous contemporaneity. The case of the three isnad linking Murtada Zabidi to Al-Babili recorded in the Nafahat is illustrative. Observe the following isnad. In the first sanad that Zabidi obtained from the Delhi-based scholar Al-Dihlawi, 4 intermediaries separate Zabidi from Al-Babili. When Zabidi left India for Mecca and met the Hadrami scholar Sagaf, he was able to gain a shorter sanad with only 2 intermediaries separating him from Babili. When Zabidi went further west to Egypt, he was able to encounter an aged scholar, Sabiq bin Ramadan al-Za'bali, who as a child had heard hadiths directly from Babili. Owing to spatial travel, Zabidi was able to upgrade his position in the chain. The last sanad allowed Zabidi to become on par with Ibrahim al-Qurani, who was not his contemporary, and a Sagaf, both of whom were only separated from Babili by 1 intermediary. This suggests that the transmission of hadith allows not only extension of space-time, but also its condensation, the latter of which is coveted by hadith scholars and motivated their incessant mobility in search for shorter isnad. While such a spatio-temporal process is intersubjective, in that they are constituted through self-other relationship formed in and through the embodied act of transmission, it nevertheless is susceptible to objectification. Inscribing the isnad, like what bin Jindan does in the Nafahat, objectifies that intersubjective spatio-temporal process into a publicly perceivable representation of processual space-time. As a textual artifact, the isnad is estranged from the subjects who make up the intersubjective connections and become legible to others from a third-person perspective. Now, the second part of the Nafhat is written as a rihla or travelogue. The events recounted took place over the course of 7 months between June and December 1930. Bin Jindan begins by describing his interaction with his family members, declaring to them his intention to go to Hajj. He continues his account by describing his visit to the Kantor for Inlande Zaken, the colonial office established to handle native and Islamic affairs to obtain a pilgrimage passport, and his interaction with other prospective pilgrims. He then recounts in details his travel to several cities and towns in East Java to visit Hadrami and Javanese scholars, business people, and friends. For each of these visits, Bin Jindan uses a formulaic sentence. I went to see so-and-so and spent the night in his house to ask for his permission and blessing, and he provided me with ... Right? He then provides a detailed description of the send-off reception held on Saturday, December 10, 1930, and on the morning of Monday, December 12, 1930, the day of his departure. The Rihla is rich with details that allows us to understand what was involved in pilgrimage preparation in the 1930s Dutch East Indies. In this sense, it is a great source for historians. But my interest here is less on those details than on how the Rihla projects an objective space-time. By this, I mean conception of space-time as an independent arena or container of human action and interaction. If the processual space-time of the isnad is engendered by names and act of transmission, the objective space-time is constituted by a clearly delineated geography and calendrical time that are presented as independent of the actions taking place therein. clearly delineated space and time serve as the arena of action peopled by actors, from family members, friends, relatives, fellow pilgrims, and colonial bureaucrats, all of whom were contemporaries of Bin Jindan. Bin Jindan begins each paragraph with clear spatio-temporal markers like date, time, and location, even before describing his acts. He measured the distance between cities and towns he visited in terms of their travel duration. What is interesting about the Rihla is how this objective space-time is imagined to intersect with the processual space-time of the Isnad. One intersection is, of course, Bin Jindan himself. As someone who inhabits both chronotopes, Bin Jindan serves as a link where the two distinct spacetimes are imagined to intersect, allowing connection between the two. Another intersection is the venerable Sheikh Hassan al-Gengongi, visited by Bin Jindan in the village of Genggong in Probolinggo, East Java. Sheikh Hassan leads an Islamic boarding school, which at the time had 1,500 students. And today, this boarding school has more than 22,000 students. It's a huge boarding school. In the Rihla, Bin Jindan describes Sheikh Hassan as a pious and knowledgeable scholar who studied under eminent scholars of Mecca and transmit hadiths from Hussein bin Muhammad al-Habshi and Mahfuz al-Tarmisi, both of which are also present in Bin Jindan's Isnad. Bin Jindan devotes 1.5 pages to recount Sheikh Hassan's biography, marking him as one of the nodes that make up the chronotope of the Isnad, who is also present in the chronotope of the Rihla. Like Bin Jindan, Sheikh Hassan stands as a corporeal link between the two spacetimes. Aside from Sheikh Hassan, the rest of the people mentioned in the Rihla only gets 1 or 2 sentences, because I think they are not nodes, right? Another name that is featured in both the Isnad and the Rihla is the centenarian female scholar Amatullah binti Abdul Ghani al-Sirhindi, whom Bin Jindan encountered in Medina during the Hajj and is also mentioned in the travelogue. The presence of names with double chronotopic existence are where the processual spacetime of the Isnad and the objective spacetime of the Rihla are imagined to intersect. These names anchor the former in the latter, allowing processual spacetime to become part of an inhabitable world, even when the two spacetimes are not isomorphic. This, I think, is what enables the Ta'ifa al-Muhaddithin to be imagined as an objectively existing society that can be joined by acquiring hadiths from those with dual chronotopic existence and transmitting them to others. The combination of the two chronotopes in a single text projects a converging spatio-temporal imaginary in and through which the Ta'ifa becomes not only conceivable, but also perceivable as part of an inhabitable world. More than explicit theories of society, what enables scholars and students of hadith like Bin Jindan to make sense of and participate in this ta'ifa is a social imaginary, made up of two distinct chronotopes, each projecting a non-isomorphic space-time that can nevertheless intersect. Such an imaginary is continually reproduced by students and scholars of hadith over the course of history. The continual reproduction of this social imaginary helps to shape and motivate, without necessarily determining, actions, interactions, and trans-regional mobilities that sociologically reproduce the ta'ifa. By composing the Nafhat, Bin Jindan, like many hadith scholars before him, reproduced this social imaginary in the hope of shaping the action of subsequent generations. Texts like the Nafhat help to foreground affinities between actors living in different times and space, mediating their belonging to a social formation that is bigger than the local and national, but also not quite global. A social formation that allows for contemporaneous and non-contemporaneous contemporaneity. Texts like the Nafhat help actors to construe their physical travels as journeys along the moral cartography projected by the Isnad, where they can encounter actors with dual chronotopic existence who perchance may allow them to get closer to the prophetic past. For those who recognize the existence of or aspire to belong to the Ta'if al-Muhaddithin, trans-regional travel like the Hajj can also be conceived as a journey to the original locus of hadiths, a place where higher isnad can be acquired from their fellow members of the Ta'ifa. Hence, we learn from the first chapter of the text that bin Jindan used the time he spent in the Hijaz to collect shorter isnad than those he already acquired in his homeland. The same can be said for travel to other regional centers of hadith, hadith transmission, like South Asia, Yemen, and Egypt. For bin Jindan and other students and scholars of hadith, spatial travel may, and ideally should, result in temporal mobility in the hope of becoming closer to the prophetic past by encountering fellow associates of the Ta'if al-Muhaddithin who may be gharib or foreign, but nevertheless qareeb, familiar to each other. So let me conclude by reiterating 3 points that I find pertinent from this work in progress in relation to decolonial Islamic studies. First, what I'm trying to push here is the need for us to explore varieties of societal or sociological concepts historically developed and employed by Muslims as a resource for theorization, instead of hastily translating them into available or more familiar concepts. Ta'ifa, for example, is an important societal framework that has remained under-theorized. We tend to hastily translate it into terms like guilt for the sake of comparison or convenience, instead of trying to understand its peculiarities and explore the spatio-temporal imaginary that undergirds it. What I have tried to do in a rather perfunctory manner is to try to assemble some pieces of the puzzle in an attempt to understand what is a ta'ifa, how it is imagined, what works of mediation is involved in realizing it into an inhabitable social formation, in the hope of enriching and expanding our repertoire of social or societal frameworks and our imagination of what a society is or how it looks like. Secondly, a conceptual study of the Ta'if al-Muhaddithin can expand the scope of our study of hadith and the culture of hadith transmission. While scholars have written extensively on isnad as a mechanism for establishing the authenticity of a hadith text, Muslims, as the works of, among others, Jonathan Brown and Garrett Davidson have suggested, also perceive isnad as a medium of connection to the prophet and the scholars of the past. In this latter sense, one can think of isnad as a semiotic form that engenders and makes visible connections to those who are otherwise absent or invisible. In performing this work, isnad project a particular spatio-temporal nexus made up of names dispersed across time and space, imbuing it with a particular shape and coherence. While historians have used isnad as a resource to reconstruct scholarly networks and transmission, I think we also need to think about the capacity of isnad as mechanics of social imaginary, as sustaining particular logic of time and space that may be different from the more dominant spatio-temporal presuppositions, and as a building block of a societal framework different from those brought about by colonialism or nationalism. This, however, does not necessarily mean that we are doing this kind of work in the spirit of negating or replacing one societal framework with another, and this is my final point. I think I agree with you, Sajjad, and here I'm thinking about your article on decolonial Quranic studies, that decolonization is about opening and including instead of foreclosing and excluding. We want to expand social scientific concepts and our ways of imagining society and scale without necessarily replacing or excluding others or reducing one to another. And this is what I learned from Bin Jindan and his ability to inhabit different space-times and social formations. The Ta'ifat al-Muhaddithin has its own space-time, but also intersects with other space-times, including the objective space-time of modernity. Bin Jindan lived and participated in a modern colonial space-time, right? And he used colonial infrastructure while simultaneously inhabiting another space-time, one with radically different spatio-temporal logic. Bin Jindan was the first Hadrami scholar to use the Nisba al-Indonesi, the Indonesian, in his written works, even before the country existed, and was a resolute Indonesian nationalist, imprisoned by the Dutch and tortured by the Japanese. But at the same time, he belonged to a trans-regional society with its own logic of belonging. If I learn one thing from Bin Jindan, the Muhaddith, the Hadrami Sayyid, and the Indonesian nationalist, it is precisely that decolonizing space-time is not about rejecting our habitation of colonial and post-colonial modernity, but it is about denying its unilateral claim of conquering alternative spatio-temporal imaginaries and their ability to engender different forms of social life. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Such a rich and suggestive talk. So much to think about and change the way one thinks about so many of these different things. I won't go in any particular order, but one of the things that one of the many things that was pinging in my head while you were elaborating your ideas. So, in terms of this translation as a guild for Taifa, I was thinking actually that a lot of people who study the Middle Ages, in Europe that is, themselves face very similar kinds of problems as we in the post-colonial world, because which is why there is now such a thing as post-colonial medieval studies. So in that respect, I would say that they have in the West, or these modern concepts, there's so much of a distortion of their own past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much of a distortion of their own temporality. Last time when we had Ulu Damini, we were talking about the incoherence of the idea of progress, and surely it does a lot in terms of distorting our sense of our own experience of time. Yeah. So I would say that in fact what you are describing is a much more realistic, in fact, rather than this. What strikes me more and more is these modern ideas of global, local, national, as you were saying, or these empty ideas of space and time. They're actually phantasmatic. Yeah, they're really they're the ones that have very little to do with reality, because reality is precisely what the kind of sense of space and time that you're describing is closer to what is real, rather than this more objectified sense of space-time that we work with, and that is really very much part of academic protocol. So just to give an example, so in this class that I'm teaching on Hikmah, we were reading Sophie Vassalo's book on Al-Ghazali, idea of moral beauty, and I think precisely because of academic protocol, we scholars, in this case, for instance, is forced to say, okay, so this idea influences Al-Ghazali coming from the Greeks, for instance. Yeah, once again, it's this particular way of conceiving of time, etc., also informs. Whereas, of course, somebody is not when you're reading Plato, you're not thinking, okay, this guy's, 2,500 years ago, etc. You're trying to directly encounter the subject matter at hand. Yeah. Right. So that's one of the thoughts that was going through my head. So I'll just start with that that remark.
Should I?
If you'd like.
Yeah. No, thank you, Nauman. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right that there seems to be a gap, right, between what's going on, for instance, in the field of European studies, especially historians of the Middle Ages, and in our own field of Islamic studies or non-European world. In that sometimes we are still wedded to and committed to terms that come from Europe, but in the field of European history has been actually questioned. And this is why of course the term guild comes from that studies of medieval Europe, and then it is used to look at the Futuwa organizations and all the crafts guilds in Khorasan, and then the Sufi orders, etc. Instead of trying to think from their own presupposition and what do they mean by, for instance, a ta'ifa? For example, an Arab 10th century Arab lexicographer, the name escapes me now, but maybe it will come back. For example, made a very interesting remarks about the fact that ta'ifa, comes from the radical that also gives us the word tawaf and tafa, right? So movement. So in what way can we think about society that is or societal framework that is very much based on mobility instead of the static and aggregate form of society that we are inherited from, say, Enlightenment thought or post-Enlightenment thought. So in a way, that's I think the challenge, right? And oftentimes, I think the difficulty is precisely that this kind of societal frameworks are not made explicit, right? Are not properly theorized. And I think Dipesh Chakrabarty said a long time ago that this is the challenge, that how can we look at practices and see that as a source of theorization when we do not have, for instance, explicit theorization of something. So yeah, absolutely. I think what you are pointing to, Nauman, is that first of all, I think somebody like bin Jindan has a much more complex sense of reality that our modern regime of space and time is a rather limiting way of seeing reality. And in fact, what we learn from him is he does not negate the modern temporal order, right? I mean, many of these hadith scholars were writing isnad, but also they were writing tarikh with a very clearly delineated chronological sense of time. I mean, they did not see it contradictory to participate in multiple temporal regimes, right? The multiple regimes of temporality. But at the same time, and whenever I talk to scholars about this, for instance, about this text, is I get the sense that, many were pushing me to historicize the text, right? Said, why are you, talking conceptually about it? You should actually historicize it, see in relation to bin Jindan, what bin Jindan was facing, and, particular history of the Dutch East Indies, etc. Yes, I understand that, but that's not what I'm trying to do, right? And this is the tendency, as you said, people are reading Plato. I mean, Agamben and Derrida are reading Plato and use it as a source of inspiration, as a source of theorization, as a source of expanding, right, and even spinning Plato. But when we read this kind of text, we are just supposed to just do an antiquarian work of, historicizing it, and that's, I think, what I'm trying to push back.
Yeah, absolutely. This sort of imperative of historicization, which is effectively a kind of fear of philosophy, fear of thinking, especially in a post-colonial context. Yeah, so which is so rich, and also it's just the resistance to changing our whatever our ontology is supposed to be. I mean, recently there was a book I was very excited by anthropologists. I can't remember now when I picked it up, I was very excited because it was about, the ontological turn. Actually, that's what it was called, the ontological turn. And then when I started reading, they said, well, we are not going to actually accept any of these alternative ontologies that we are going to talk about in this book. Yeah, so this is anthropologists. So, in order to stay with the academic protocol, you can study it, you can say, okay, they have a different ontology, but you can never accept that other ontology.
Right.
That's that next step you cannot take.
Right.
Yeah, because supposedly it's not objective. Which is very strange. I mean, the fact of the matter is that people kept dates and had chronicles, etc. in the past. Yeah, this is not a modern invention, right? Dates and calendars, etc. existed, but in the case of the modern, what you're doing essentially is, even though it's supposed to just be time, you've simultaneously imported an ontology whereby the past constantly disappears. Yeah, you're constantly being pushed to alienate the past. And while you were describing this experience, I've had a couple of these kinds of experiences, which immediately, because you think, for instance, in our region, 1857 is supposed to be this really watershed moment. Yeah. But at the same time, it's it's been completely classicized, as it were, and people who were around at that time. So it appears as if it's almost in God knows how long ago it happened. But then I encountered somebody in Lahore who I became friends with, much older than me, and he told me that he had heard a first-hand account of the events of 1857 from his great-grandmother. So immediately I was sitting with somebody, who had heard a first-person account of 1857, and that immediately changed my perspective on the whole thing.
Right. It elevates your sanad, right?
Yes, exactly. So, so I know exactly what you're talking about, and that's really, I mean, it's not like the past can simply disappear. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the past is sedimented and concretely into the present. How could it be otherwise? Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And also how that I mean, what interests me also is how that kind of spatio-temporal. Well, first of all, I think it is telling that in most, in social science and humanities, for instance, that the term scale is usually only used to refer to space, which is quite different, for instance, from in ecology, in even geography, for that matter, because they also talk about temporal a scale. But oftentimes when we think about scale, we think in terms of space, and that for me betrays a particular acceptance of this presentist mode of seeing the world, that no, it is the space that you can expand or constrict, but not the time in the way. So but also what I'm interested in is how then that kind of temporal imagination, spatial temporal imagination, actually shape action, human action. That is, one of the things that inspired me to write this, to think about this, is there was one time I was in Indonesia when I was doing my field work. This is back in 2011 or 2012. There came an Azhari scholar, a muhaddith, a young and upcoming muhaddith, Sheikh Usama Al-Azhari, who actually Talal Asad discusses in one of his article on what is it, Egyptian Revolution. So Sheikh Osama came to Indonesia. It was his first visit. So we sit down with him, and then he said, you know, I want to visit this guy. Will you help me, go to this guy? And he gave the name, and so who is this guy? Nobody knows this guy, right? I asked several scholars in Jakarta at the time, and nobody knows who this guy is. But then we keep on asking until we actually found the guy. And when we went to visit him, I mean, this guy is not known as a scholar or anything. I mean, when we saw him, he was just sitting on the porch of his house wearing a polo shirt and smoking a cigarette. And apparently this guy is actually, one of the main destination for Osama Al-Azhari, because he somehow, back in the days was studied under Sheikh Yasin Al-Fadani in Mecca, and he holds like some of the shortest chains of certain narrations. So what we ended up doing was Sheikh Osama sat with this guy and quickly recite like several texts in his presence, right? And he brought an audio, he brought the camera, and he just basically recite an entirety of a text just to get the isnad from this guy. And that just, amazed me. I mean, a person who never been to Indonesia, who do not know many scholars in Indonesia, was able to identify and find a person, right, who is supposed to be his destination. And this is the point about they are gharib, but they are qarib as well. So there is a way in which this muhaddith, they, whenever they visit certain places, they know where are the nodes, where are the intersections between this space time. And that, certainly is something that very much interests me. And I want to understand more in a way.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Sajjad, please.
Yeah, when you were first speaking, I was thinking, kind of connecting with your book, that this is really about the construction of authority. Mm. But in some ways, actually, that would be too easy a conclusion to arrive at. Normally, we tend to think of that when we're looking at a particular text, which is constructing a certain lineage of some sort, that it is precisely about using that connection to the Prophet to justify one's own authority. Right? But it does seem to me that there's something a bit more going on here, and it's not just about the simplicity of that, because I mean, I remember doing this like for years and years in introductory classes on Islam, that every possible Muslim collectivity conceives of their identity through some sort of link back to the Prophet. I mean, that's just a basic fact of Muslim life, which it's sometimes astonishing that you even have to say that, but you do have to say it in an introductory class. So part of that is making sense of that, and then I guess then the question is, well, what is it particularly about this study of hadith which makes that imagining different from another imagining, which I would have thought you might have talked about, which is basically the Hadrami kind of Sayyid lineage connection. So often when we think of the Hadrami scholars in the Indian Ocean context, we're thinking of Siyada, we're thinking of lineages of blood, of kinship back to the Prophet. Right. And often when they conceive of their sort of taifa of scholars, so if I take, for example, a comparison, someone I worked on a bit, the 17th century scholar Sayyid Ali Khan Madani, who of course was born in Medina, lived in Hyderabad, ended up in Shiraz at the end of his life. So for him, his conception of what his scholarly family is a very polyglot group, are actually connected by kinship, right? So through different ways. So on his mother's side, it's through a Syrian Shafi'i lineage. On his father's side, of course, a 12 Shi'i kind of lineage going back to Shiraz and beyond. So that kind of interconnection is a slightly different sort of one,
Right.
and that's actually much more exclusive, because then the issue is, well, where do people who are not Sada fit into that kind of mix of it? Whereas the picture you've presented of this particular taifa, it's not exclusive in that way. And for me, that's a bit of a surprise, because I kind of expect Hadramis and Ba'alawis to tend to be very clannish in that sense. That, when you look at other, the really big famous figures of that tradition, it tends to be very clannish. It's about this particular lineage. It's about the Sada, especially. So that's different. Now, of course, the question is that because he's focusing on hadith, or is that actually a feature of the way in which trans-regionalism is developing this time? I mean, is that actually where the colonial sphere starts to have some sort of impact? I mean, I'm kind of wondering about that specificity, or whether he's drawing upon some other models which existed before him. On that. So, kind of trying to unpack this broader concept of Taifat al-Muhaddithin.
Thank you, Sajjad. That's wonderful. Yeah, I totally agree with you that all of this is really about whatever Muslims do are about somehow can be traced back to the prophetic past. But of course, the fact that there are different ways of connecting to that prophetic past actually opens up different not only normative models, as I talk about in my book, but also different forms of social formation, different imaginaries of sociality. And one of which is, of course, for the Ba'alawi Sayyids is lineage, is genealogy, right? And I talked about this. Eng Seng Ho talks about this, the importance of nasab, and you're absolutely right that it is exclusive, and it's all about really showing and imagining oneself as somehow separated from the rest of the Muslim world. And this is, of course, in the narratives of the Ba'alawi, that we saved ourselves when we migrated from Iraq to Hadramaut, and which is like almost a terra nullius in their narration. And so we are not in the centers, we're in a peripheral region, and hence we could save the purity of our teachings. And Ibn Jindan certainly participates in that. Many of his works are on ansab, on nasab, on genealogies. He wrote a lot of genealogies. He wrote also history of Islam in Southeast Asia that foregrounds the role of the Ba'alawi Sayyids in bringing Islam to the region. For example, one work that he wrote is a veil, is an addendum to the Tarikh Nur al-Safir, written by Abdul Qadir al-Aidrus from Gujarat, right? Which is a centenarian history of the 10th century, fi Tarikh Qarn al-Ashir, right? Of the 10th Islamic century, that only talks about the Middle East and India, right? And so Bin Jindan basically wrote a dial to that, completing the story all the way to Southeast Asia. And of course, the same narration of, combining both, Sufi metaphysics on prophetic light, on Nur Muhammad, and genealogy and tarikh, history, to anchor the prophetic light in history through the mobility of the Hadrami Sayyids, right? And we learned from Eng Seng Ho's work on that. But interestingly, there are certain people among the Ba'alawi Sayyids, certainly in a minority, who actually participate in this kind of hadith scholarship milieu. And until today, it's still a minority. Most Ba'alawis are not interested in this. I mean, they would transmit the hadith, al-musalsal bil awaliya and all this stuff, but they're not really a participant of this broader. Some of them who actually migrated to the Hijaz right? They became part and parcel of that hadith scholarly community. Some who were in Egypt also did that. In Indonesia, I think bin Jindan and one other guy is, as far as I know, Abdullah bil Faqih, are the two Hadrami Sayyid scholar who actually participate in the hadith milieu. And I think that cannot be reduced to only the question of colonialism, but also there is a long tradition of certain individuals from the Ba'alawi lineage who try to participate in that as well. Though I think, in an earlier study of bin Jindan that I did a long time ago, I also talk about how, why hadith became quite important in the 20th century Indonesian Dutch Indies, particularly because, authority based on lineage, on bloodline, on genealogy was actually challenged during this time. So somebody like bin Jindan, and at the same time, there was a rise of hadith studies, right, as part of the Salafi movements of going back to the Quran and the hadith, etc. So bin Jindan actually, one can read bin Jindan as somehow situated in relation to that kind of modern reformist discourse of going back to the hadith, but also one that is rooted in this kind of chain of transmission that perhaps modern reformists are not quite.
And that obviously is precisely why you have those 18th century connections with Shah Waliullah, with Murtada Zabidi, with that kind of the Hijazi circle of Ibrahim Qurani, his son, etc. So I mean, certainly that element of why hadith and why can't you justify authority as a wider package, whether it's through some sort of charisma, whether it's through some sort of Sufi lineages, or whether it's through blood. I think that would certainly suggest why this question of hadith is important. On the specific, okay, so on the very specific thing of so in one sense it's a nice little thing that, okay, I'm going to write about my journey for Hajj by starting to talk about intention, but there must be something else. I mean, why pick on this particular hadith? I mean, is it because it gives him a certain way of imagining what this taifa is, as something which is which kind of collapses different kinds of temporalities? I mean, why this particular hadith? I mean, he could have picked so many different texts.
Right.
He could have picked texts which are maybe much more salient to Hajj, for example.
Right.
So anything further on why this particular hadith?
Yeah, I think precisely because he narrated that particular hadith because he wanted to basically start that, the point that, the beginning of a journey to Hajj is the intention, right? And he actually, at the end of the hadith, after narrating the hadith, then he said that, and the thoughts came to me to go to Hajj, and I made the intention, as the Sayyid Sadat has mentioned that, in that hadith, and I made this intention at this particular time, at this hour, etc. Hence, I think doing both moves of presenting this, space-time of the isnad, right? But then anchoring it in a very specific time and place, making him at the same time as the intersection between the two. So I think that's why that one particular hadith. But you can just say that one particular hadith without going to recount all this isnad, which basically takes more than half of the text, right? And I think that is what really interests me is that, and the contrast that space-time, when juxtaposed together, actually creates. But to go back to your earlier question, Sajjad, is that, the Ta'ifa Muhaddithin is among one of those Ta'ifa that is much, more accessible, right, for Muslims. I mean, it's still a Ta'ifa. It's not like the Ummah, everybody, but it is, theoretically speaking, any Muslim can actually join this Ta'ifa. And hence, we read, for instance, where is it? Asma Sayyid's book. We read somebody like Nidamul Mulk and even some of the rulers, Mongol rulers, would actually participate in listening to hadith recitation, right? Just to be part of the ta'ifa, just to be part of the ta'ifa. So I think it is a kind of a societal framework that allows people to see themselves as being part of, but at the same time is this different from the general imagined Muslim ummah, not as exclusive as nasab, certainly not like Sufi ta'ifa that some of which forbade you from joining other Sufi ta'ifa, but it is at the same time a ta'ifa. And so that's what interests me. I mean, what is a ta'ifa, right? So that's
interesting because I can think of a couple of friends I have who are very proud of these ijazas for hadith they have, which they both acquired when they were very young, teenagers, basically because they met someone very famous and they heard something from them, but they're not scholars at all. They're just a standard average people. But this kind of scroll is a treasured possession of theirs, which they will take out and show people. So I think that element of hadith as a living kind of presence, I think is important. So this idea of the living presence is important, and in that way it plays role alongside different kinds of presences. I mean, obviously, we still have lots of Sufi shrines. We still have the actual shrine of the Prophet in Medina. I mean, these are other kinds of living presence, and perhaps the hadith one is a slightly different one, and perhaps even it's one which in Salafi times is less controversial as well.
That's right.
And there's other forms of presences. I mean, as I said again, for most Muslims across the world, the direct living presence, whether it's through descendants, whether it's through shrines of Sufis or the direct shrine of the Prophet, they're very powerful presences. But they have a kind of this contrived controversy as it's become in the modern period, which makes it that sort of it's not even memory, it is actual, it's reality, it's there, and it's something that if you have that sort of mindset, it, right? So it's very easy to see if you sit, for example, in the Rawda, just kind of opposite from where the Prophet's tomb is, and you just notice and observe people as they come and go, and you can tell the difference between someone who is overwhelmed by presence and someone who actually doesn't seem to feel it at all. For whom this is a historical relic of some sort. It's a historical relic which has it's got sediments of history, but the past is not present for them. It's just this particular version of the mosque, and that's it. Whereas for others, you can see when they're looking, they're not seeing what's literally there. They're seeing much more, and that's very powerful.
Absolutely. And this is what I'm very much interested in now, in thinking about history with presence and the notion of presence. I mean, Indian Ocean Studies is already developing, very well, and there's a lot of work that's been done. But I still get the sense, except for a very few, it's still presented as a, I don't like to use this word, but a disenchanted oceanic space, right? It's a disenchanted world. So there's a lot on political economy. There's a lot of mobility, etc., mechanics of pilgrimage, etc., etc. But many of the travelogues I read, many of the correspondences, many of the poems that these Hadrami scholars, for instance, talk about, something else going on, and that presence is not only tied to a particular place like Mecca or Medina, but it could also be, there can also be prophetic presence or divine presence somewhere in Java and somewhere in Singapore, etc., etc. So it is that oceanic space suffused with different temporalities and different presence is what I'm now, trying to focus.
But I guess that's precisely the sort of so the one of the elements of decoloniality, as I see it, is to try and overcome certain kinds of binaries, and the religious secular one is the classic kind of binary, but also the material and the spiritual one as well. So we often assume, even people who will kind of reject dualism and any other kind of conversation, we often assume this kind of basic dualism, and how they're quite separate. But every element of what happens, I think, in a pilgrimage, or maybe even, if someone is sitting there, say, as you said, recounting a particular hadith, there's lots of different things going on there. So there are elements of materiality and physicality, and which arise out of our embodiment, right? But it's not as simple as that. And to focus on one over the other doesn't seem to make sense to me. So, I'm perfectly happy with people studying pilgrimage to look at things like how much does it cost, and is it possible to, travel from here to here in so many days, or, how many physical beds are there to like host all these pilgrims, all these kinds of things. How much does it cost? Prostitution, commerce and everything. But, that's part of a much wider package of experience of emotion, which is not just about going from point A to point B, because in that sense, even I think the point I'm trying to make, which I think does follow from what you're saying, is that spatiotemporality is not fixed and not static in the way we often assume it is. And it's kind of setting aside that kind of static nature of the spatiotemporality, which has to be considered. In the most miraculous form, that's the whole notion of tayyar ard, right? The whole point of tayyar ard is that spatiotemporality has no fixed nature. It is not a constraint of any sort. It's not a container.
Right, it's not a container, that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess I'm just kind of repeating what you've already said.
Can I say something as Ismail, unless you want to respond to
No, please.
I mean, so there are a couple of different comments. So immediately from what Sajjad just said, usually when you talk about spatio temporality, say zaman or makan, yeah. But the moment you say zaman or makan, you're necessarily also referring, even if implicitly, to that which is not zaman or makan, which is atemporal. So it's not the same kind of reference. Yeah, it necessarily implies a non-temporal or atemporal dimension, vertical dimension to existence, which of course also has implications for what supposedly objective spatio-temporality actually means. Yeah. So, and the other thing that I wanted to remark on is the fact that our academic protocols are actually geared towards a kind of, or have the effect of a kind of existential innovation. Yeah. So what you're talking about, action, that's one thing that you talked about several times, action and practice. And actually the spatio-temporality is also both being dynamic, as Sajjad was saying, but also an active creation on the part of the actor. Yeah. Apart from the other thing that I was talking about earlier, which are academic protocols, not accepting other ontologies, it also, and once again, not being realistic, because that's not how anybody reads. That's not how anybody experiences time. In fact, so these are, really morbid abstractions, existentially enervating abstractions. Whereas what the life world, for lack of an other better word immediately, that you're describing, is actually oriented towards the intensification, of existence. And the other thing that I wanted to speculate on is this question of intention. So I was wondering about the same thing that Sajjad asked you about at the beginning of the talk. Why is it that it's this particular hadith? So it strikes me actually that, and I've been thinking about this too. So intention, today you would think that intention is simply given. But intention is, of course, not simply given. It's something that not only as you form it, you have to do something to yourself in order to form the right intention. But it's also something that a task that is not accomplished until it's accomplished over time. So I cannot form my intention once and for all. It's as I travel through space and time that I'll have to continue to work on my intention. So intention is something that one continues to form. Once you form an intention, you're also forming the intention to form the intention over over a certain trajectory, both in space and in time.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Intention is so in that sense, intention is also something that is a trajectory, a travel, safar.
No.
What do you?
So, go on. Sorry.
No, that's it.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's a great way to think about this. Intention as in itself, has its own spatio-temporal trajectory and something that is ongoing, something that has to be maintained, right? And in the case of bin Jindan, it is also, there's nothing presentist about it. I think that's what I'm trying to say. There's nothing presentist about it, in that first, that act of making intention is informed by 1,300 years of history, right? Connecting bin Jindan through all these names and presence back to the Prophet, but also, opening up, generating a spatio-temporal process, right? That through the actual, making the intention, but also acting on that intention and maintaining that very intention. So I think, in other words, there's not only the dimension of past, but what your comment suggested is there's a futurity to it as well, right? There's a futurity to intention. That's a great point. Thank you.
That another aspect which just kind of struck me was intention is also a way in which you make yourself present. Because it's a conscious act, and I think that's probably why there is such an emphasis. In fiqh, there's such a massive emphasis on intention. Right. So I think back to my own experience in ḥajj, and where after we, obviously we were all kind of told to verbalize our intention at the miqat, right. And then of course afterwards, when we got to Mecca, one person turned around and said, I didn't do it, right? And so we had to send that person back. I remember I was chatting to the people saying, well, what difference does it make? I mean, the fact that he was there surely means he had intention. But what it actually does show is that even though he was there with us, he was basically absent, right? Because he's probably thinking, I don't know, whatever. I mean, kind of distracted. And so it's the issue of intention as a way of kind of taking away from distraction, and there's an obvious reason why that would be important in an act of worship, because it's about the presence of the heart, as it said. That's a direct link, and so in that sense, I'm kind of answering the question. It could be that the reason why bin Jindan is doing that is because it's a way of him inserting his own presence into this wider presence of the Islam.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great point, because and particularly that whole act of voicing that intention. And I think scholars like Brink Messick, for instance, talked about, the importance of this act of voicing, right? Or even Quranic recitation as an act of presencing Kalamullah al-Qadim, right? That, brings about an agentive ambiguity, etc., etc. I think you're right that and even in the act of this hadith transmission, voice and voicing as a way of making present is a very important. And yet that present is not just a simple present. It is a present that is adumbrated. It is a presence that is spatially and temporally part of something longer. And it may be a present that also involves the transcendent, in certain kind of voicing, right? Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right in terms of, voicing as an act of presencing, making oneself present, and not just oneself, but making other things that constitute oneself present. I mean, I remember, for instance, Bin Jindan has a book called Mir'atul Zaman fi Hayat Ibn Jindan, right? And it's supposed to be an autobiography, but basically the book starts with his mother and a description of his mother and his father and his grandmother and his grandfather from both sides, great grandmother and great grandfather, etc. And by the end of the book, there's nothing on Bin Jindan himself, and yet he calls it an autobiography, which I find it fascinating. I mean, it's just a very different way of presenting and presencing yourself, right? Who are you? You are these people, right, who constitute you. I mean, I think, if we read ethnographies of Polynesia and Melanesia, there's a lot of this kind of, the self that is not like the way the Western world understand the self, but the self as a multiple, as constituted by multiple presence and multiple history.
It's kind of like a bundle theory of selfhood.
Right. It's a bundling, right? The selfhood is a bundling. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Nauman, do you have anything else? I'm just
good.
On for almost an hour and a half, and unfortunately, we don't seem to have had anything coming through from Facebook. But obviously, this video will remain there for some time, and it's quite possible now and then people do come in with questions or comments later. So we'll try and keep an eye on that. Thank you for that, Ismail. I think that was a wonderful conversation. For those who may not have read his new book, please do go and have a look at it. And we definitely look forward to seeing the new book when it, inshallah, will be out. So thank you for joining us. And thank you for everyone who's been watching this and who may watch it for joining us as well. We, I think, have a few weeks before the next one. There's a bit of a break, but we have, I think, roughly 3 of these seminars left, or is it 2 before we finish this term? I think there's 2 or 3 before the end of this term, and then we'll have a little break over Easter, and then we'll hopefully resume with a few after Easter to take us in through to summer. So please do join us for those. Thank you once again, everyone. Thank you, Ismail, and
thank you.
I hope to see you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Allah Hafiz.
Assalamu alaikum.